I keep notebooks, always have. Grocery lists, things I'm afraid to say out loud, the exact words people use when they're about to ruin your life. So I can tell you that the sentence that broke my mother apart was 11 words long, and that my father said it while smiling, with cake frosting on the corner of his mouth. I wrote it down that night in the car. My hands were shaking so badly, the letters slanted off the page like they were trying to crawl away. People love to say a woman found herself after something like this. They make it sound clean. A montage. New haircut, new town, sunset. But I was there for the parts no one films. The month she couldn't get off the bathroom floor. The day she sold her wedding ring for less than a tank of gas. The night she stood in a stranger's kitchen at 4 a.m. with flour up to her elbows and finally stopped crying. This is the story of how a 59-year-old woman got called too old in front of 40 people who said nothing. And what she became instead. I'm not going to tell you it was fair. I'm not going to tell you it was easy. I'm going to tell you what actually happened. Stay with me. There's a part near the end I still can't read out loud without stopping. The banquet hall smelled like warming chicken and somebody else's perfume, and my mother was laughing at a joke that wasn't funny because that was her job for 34 years, to make my father's friends feel clever. I want to start there in that exact second because for years afterward I'd try to find the moment things tipped. There wasn't one. That's the thing nobody tells you. Catastrophes don't have doors you walk through. They have weather. You just slowly realize you're soaked. It was their anniversary, 34 years. Not a round number, which I remember thinking was strange. Who throws a party for 34? But my father, Gerald Vesey, loved an occasion the way some men love a mirror. He'd rented the Elks Lodge, hired the band that played at every wedding and funeral in our county, and stood at the front of the room in a shirt my mother had ironed that afternoon. I watched her do it. She'd hummed. She'd licked her thumb and pressed down a stubborn collar point and said, "He likes the points sharp," like that was a love language, like that meant something. My mother's name is Lorraine. She was wearing a green dress she'd bought on layaway and finished paying off the week before. I knew that because I drove her to pick it up. She'd held it against herself in the shop window's reflection and asked me, in this small voice I hadn't heard since I was a kid, asking, do I look stupid, whether green washed her out at her age. "You look beautiful, Mom," I said. I meant it. She did. She had the kind of face that earned its lines honestly, laugh lines, worry lines, the deep one between her brows from 40 years of squinting at recipes and bills and my father's moods. So we're in the lodge. The band is on a break. Gerald taps his glass with a fork, ting, 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 and everyone goes quiet because Gerald is the kind of man rooms go quiet for. He sold farm equipment for a living, and he could sell you a combine you didn't need and a service plan to go with it. And somewhere along the way, he started selling himself the idea that he was a great man trapped in a small life. He thanked everyone for coming. He made a joke about marriage being a life sentence with good behavior, and the room laughed and my mother laughed too, that obedient laugh, her hand resting on the back of his chair. Then he said it. He looked around the room, this performer's pause, and he said, "Course, a man my age, he starts to wonder, what's he doing with somebody too old to enjoy it?" 11 words, well, the part that mattered, somebody too old to enjoy it. I keep notebooks so I can be exact. There was a sound after he said it that I've never been able to describe to anyone. It wasn't a gasp. It was the opposite of a gasp. It was 40 people deciding at the same instant to look at their plates. The clink of a fork being set down very, very carefully. The band's drummer coughing into his fist in the back. And my mother. She kept smiling. That's the part that still wakes me up. She kept the smile on, like a woman holding a door shut against a storm. And for one horrible second, she even nodded, as if she were agreeing to be the joke, as if 34 years had trained her to make sure even her own humiliation didn't inconvenience anyone. I was 28. I want to tell you I stood up. I want to tell you I threw a drink, made a speech, dragged her out of there with her head high. I didn't. I sat frozen with a forkful of green bean casserole halfway to my mouth, and I did the most useless thing a person can do, which is nothing, and I have spent a long time forgiving myself for it, and I'm not all the way there yet. It was my Aunt Deb, my mother's sister, who finally stood. She didn't yell. She just stood up so fast her chair scraped, and she said, loud enough to carry, "Lorraine, honey, come help me find the ladies' room." Which was insane because Deb had been to that lodge 100 times. Everyone knew it. That was the point. She was throwing my mother a rope. And my mother took it. She rose, smoothed the green dress, and walked out on Deb's arm with her chin level. And from the back you could see her shoulders were shaking even though her steps were even, and I thought, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen and the saddest, both at once, and I will never get them untangled. I should tell you about Gerald, because if I make him a cartoon villain you won't believe the rest, and you need to believe the rest. He wasn't a monster. That's the inconvenient truth that makes these stories hard. He carried groceries for the elderly. He cried at the national anthem. He could be funny and warm, and he taught me to drive in the church parking lot with the patience of a saint, his hand light on the back of my seat, saying, "Easy, easy, you've got it." People liked him. People love men like Gerald, which is exactly how men like Gerald get to be the way they are. The world keeps clapping, so why would they stop the act? Somewhere in his late 50s he'd gotten frightened. I see that now. Frightened of getting old, of getting small, of the fact that the world that had always clapped for him was starting to look past him toward younger, louder men. And instead of sitting in that fear like the rest of us have to, he reached for the cheapest cure there is. He made someone else smaller so he could feel tall. Her name was Danielle, 34, worked in the office at the dealership. I'd met her at the Christmas party the year before. She'd been kind to me, complimented my boots, which makes it worse somehow. She didn't break up my parents' marriage. You can't break something that's already cracked all the way through and just standing there out of habit. She was the excuse, not the cause. The cause was a frightened man and 3 decades of a woman shrinking herself to fit in the space he left her. We didn't know about Danielle that night. We found out 2 weeks later when my father moved his clothes into a duffel bag while my mother was at her shift at the pharmacy and left a note on the kitchen table held down by the salt shaker. I have the note. I won't tell you what it said. I'll tell you it was 4 sentences long, and that one of them began with the words, "You have to understand," which is the single most cowardly way an English sentence has ever started. For a while, my mother did the thing where you pretend you're fine, so hard that you almost convince the furniture. She went to work. She paid the bills, or tried. The house was in his name, the cars were in his name. The savings were in an account she'd never needed to worry about. That being a thing he'd said to her like a gift. "Don't you worry about the money, Laurie," and now the not worrying had a price, and the price was that she had no idea where anything was or what was hers. She'd given 34 years to the inside of a life, and he'd kept the keys to the outside of it. I moved back in. My apartment lease was up anyway, and I told her it was for me, that I needed to save money, which was half true. The real reason was that I'd come over one Tuesday and found her sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon, still in her robe, holding a coffee cup that I could tell from the door was stone cold, and she was just looking at the salt shaker, where the note had been, like it might say something different if she stared long enough. "Mom." She looked up and smiled fast, the storm door smile. "Hi, baby. You hungry? I could make." And then she stopped, because she'd opened the fridge that morning and it had been mostly empty and she hadn't gone to the store, and the smile cracked right down the middle and she put her hand over her mouth and said, through her fingers, "I don't know what I'm supposed to make for dinner if it's just me. 34 years and I never once made dinner for one. Isn't that," she laughed, this terrible wet laugh, "isn't that the stupidest thing you ever heard?" I sat down next to her and I didn't say it wasn't stupid because she'd have heard the lie. I just held her hand. It was cold too. Everything in that house was cold that winter. The thermostat was in his name philosophically if not literally. She kept it at 62 because she felt guilty using the heat, as if comfort were something she had to be granted permission for. In my notebook from that month, there's a page that just says, in my handwriting, she apologized to the dog for crying. She said sorry to the dog. That's where she was. That's the bottom of the first part of this. A woman who had spent her whole life making sure she was never any trouble, apologizing to a golden retriever for the inconvenience of her own grief. Here's the morally heavy thing, and it's mine, not hers. I'll just say it. About 6 weeks in, my father called the house. I answered. He wanted to talk to your mother, be an adult about this. And before I handed her the phone, I stood in the hallway and I had a choice. Because I knew that if I gave her that phone, he'd do the thing he always did, which was apologize just enough to keep a foot in the door, keep her hopping, keep her waiting, keep her his even after he'd left. Because a man like Gerald doesn't like to throw anything away even when he's done using it. And part of me wanted that. God help me. Part of me wanted my parents back together so badly that I almost handed her the phone, almost let her be hurt again, because her being hurt and married was a shape I recognized, and her being free and devastated was a country I didn't have a map for. I didn't give her the phone. I told him she was asleep. He said, "It's 4 in the afternoon, June," and I said, "I know what time it is, Dad," and I hung up. Then I went into the kitchen and lied to my mother's face. I said it was a wrong number. She was at the sink with her hands in the dishwater, and she looked at me a half-second too long, and I will never know if she believed me or if she just decided to let me protect her, the way Deb let her hold her chin up while her shoulders shook. I chose for her. I don't know if I had the right. That night I heard her in her room, not crying past crying, just talking quietly to herself, and I crept down the hall and I heard her practicing. That's the only word for it. She was saying in different tones, "I'm doing fine, thank you," over and over, trying to find the version that sounded true. "I'm doing fine, thank you. I'm doing fine, thank you." She never found it, not that night. But she kept practicing. And if there's one thing I want you to carry into the next part, it's that. A woman alone in a cold room at midnight, with nothing left and no map, and a daughter down the hall who just told her a lie out of love, practicing how to sound okay until the day she might be. That's not weakness. I used to think it was. I had it exactly backwards. The thing about hitting bottom is that nobody hands you a trumpet. There's no announcement. You just one day notice the falling has stopped and you're lying still, and the silence is somehow worse than the fall. For my mother, the still part lasted most of a winter. I won't pretend I understood it at the time. I was 28 and furious, and I wanted her to do something, fight him, sue him, key his truck, anything but the slow gray nothing of those months. I'd come home from my own job. I taught 4th grade, which is its own kind of survival, and find evidence of her day in negative space. A meal not eaten, a phone not answered, the same library book open to the same page for a week. She'd stopped going to church because people were kind, and their kindness, she said, weighs about 40 pounds and I can't carry it right now. She'd lost weight. She'd lost the green dress, gave it to Goodwill in a black trash bag, and when I asked why, she said flat, "It's not a dress for the life I have." That sentence sat in me like a stone. The savings, it turned out, were not as protected as my father had promised. There was a lawyer, a good one, hired by Gerald, who knew which county judges golfed with whom. My mother got the house, which sounds like a victory until you understand the house came with a mortgage she couldn't carry on a pharmacy tech's pay, and the upkeep of a building too big for one person, full of the furniture of a marriage. She got to keep the museum of her own loss. He got the liquid money, the good truck, the boat, and Danielle, who I heard was already picking out tile for a kitchen in a new build across town. I bring up the money because resilient stories love to skip it. They cut from heartbreak to triumph and pretend the rent got paid by montage. It didn't. My mother sold her wedding ring on a Tuesday and marched to a pawn shop 2 towns over so no one would see, and she got $210 for a ring that had meant the world, and she used it to fix the water heater. She told me about it in the car, dry-eyed, and then she said, "You know what I keep thinking? At least it was finally useful." and we both laughed until we were crying and she had to pull over. That was the first crack of light, honestly, the laughing. You can't laugh and be entirely dead at the same time. I noted it. Literally, I have it in a notebook, March 14. Mom laughed at the ring thing, real laugh, first one. Here's how the bakery happened, and it's so ordinary it's almost insulting, given how much it would come to matter. My mother couldn't sleep. Never could after. She'd be up at 3, 4 in the morning and she'd started baking. Not for any reason, just because the kitchen was the one room in that house that had always been hers, where Gerald had never set foot except to be fed. Bread, mostly. Her grandmother's recipe, the one she'd made my whole childhood, where you have to knead it by hand and feel the dough talk back to you, as she put it. She said her hands remembered things her head was too tired to. So our house started filling up with bread, loaves on every surface. More than 2 people could eat, way more, and she started leaving them on neighbors' porches before dawn, anonymous like a sad little ghost. The Hendersons, old Mr. Prout, the young couple with the colicky baby. She'd leave a warm loaf wrapped in a dish towel and slip away before the porch light came on. And one of those neighbors, I still get chills, one of those neighbors was a man named Sal Farrow, who owned the diner/bakery out on Route 9, the kind of place truckers stop at, Formica tables, pie under glass domes. Sal had buried his wife 2 years before. He knew about 3 a.m. He knew about hands that won't stop, because if they stop the mind starts. He figured out it was my mother leaving the bread, because of course he did, it's a small town. But instead of saying thank you, instead of the 40 pounds of kindness, he did something smarter. He left a note on our porch. Under a rock where the salt shaker would have been if it were a kitchen table, which is a coincidence I've never gotten over. The note said, and I have this one too, she gave it to me years later, it said, "Whoever's making this bread is wasting a gift on people who don't deserve it. I'll pay $14 an hour and you can cry in my kitchen all you want, nobody back there but me at that hour. Sal, P.S. the crumb's a little tight. We'll fix that. The crumb's a little tight. We'll fix that." My mother read that part out loud to me and then sat down very suddenly on the porch steps, the note in her hand, and she said, "He said we." Like it was the most extraordinary word in the English language. After a year of and you have to understand, a stranger had written "we'll fix that" about her bread, and it undid her in the best way. She took the job. She was 59 years old and she put on an apron and learned to run a commercial oven, and she was scared every single day for the first month, and she did it anyway. That's the trait, if you're keeping track, the one I'd been too angry to see in her. Not weakness. Endurance. The flat, unglamorous, get up again at 3 a.m. kind that doesn't trend on the internet because there's no before and after photo, for she simply did not quit. I want to be honest about the middle, because the middle is where these things actually get decided, not the beginning and not the end. It was not a clean rise. There were setbacks that had nothing to do with character and everything to do with the meanness of luck. The truck she'd been left with died in the worst week of February, and she couldn't get to work, and Sal, and this tells you everything. Sal drove out and picked her up at 3 a.m. for 3 weeks straight, in the dark, in the cold. And they didn't talk much, and she said those silent drives healed something in her that a year of well-meaning conversation hadn't touched. "He never once asked me how I was doing," she said. "He just handed me coffee and let me be a person who didn't have to perform being okay." There was a worse setback. My father hearing through the grapevine that Lorraine was working at a diner now, and I cannot stress enough the contempt he packed into that word diner, made it his business to come in, with Danielle, on a Saturday, sat in my mother's section, ordered the special and watched her work, and there was a smirk on him, I heard, that everyone in that place wanted to wipe off with a cast iron pan. My mother did not crack. She poured their coffee. Her hand was steady. And when Gerald, loud enough for the counter to hear, said something about how it was nice she'd found something to keep busy, my mother set down the pot and looked at him and said, "She told me this part herself, and her voice when she told it was the calmest I'd heard it in 2 years. She said, "It is, thank you, the work suits me." That's it, that's all. The work suits me. No fight. No scene. She'd spent a year practicing how to sound okay until it was true, and somewhere along the line it had become true, and Gerald heard it and the smirk. Sal told me this, watching from the pass-through. The smirk just fell off his face because he'd come there to find her broken, and what he found instead was a woman who didn't need anything from him anymore. And that's the one thing a man like Gerald cannot survive: being unnecessary. They didn't finish their meal. Left a bad tip. My mother put it in the jar and split it with the dishwasher like always. I wrote that night in the notebook. He came to watch her drown and she handed him coffee. I think that's what winning looks like. It's so much quieter than I thought. The morally heavy choice in this part is hers, and it's the one I'm proudest of, even though it cost her. Aunt Deb wanted my mother to go scorched earth. Tell everyone. There were things she could have said about Gerald, true things, things that would have burned his standing in that town to the ground. He'd cut corners at the dealership, there were customers he'd cheated. There was more than Danielle, and not all of it was as consensual as he'd have liked people to think. Deb had receipts, almost literally. And there was a version of my mother, the spiteful version, the one I was secretly rooting for, who could have lit the match. She didn't. Not because she was a saint. She was very clear with me about that. "I'm not forgiving him," she said, kneading dough at our kitchen table, not looking up. "Don't you ever think this is forgiveness." I just looked at the two roads. One road, I spend the next 2 years being a woman whose whole life is about a man who left her. Even if I win, I lose because I'm his again. His story, his scandal, his ex-wife on a mission. The other road, I make bread, and I'm late on the mortgage and nobody claps for me, and he just... She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough, hard. He just isn't the main thing anymore. I want the road where he isn't the main thing. She chose to be unremarkable on purpose. To let him keep his reputation, not as a gift to him but as a refusal. A refusal to organize one more year of her life around the gravity of Gerald Vesey. It cost her the satisfaction. It cost her Deb's approval for a while. And it was, I think, the single most powerful thing she ever did, and you will never see it in a movie because it looks like nothing. It looks like a woman making bread. By the end of that second year she'd been promoted, sort of. Sal didn't believe in titles, but she ran the morning kitchen, and the bread out on Route 9 had become a thing people drove from 2 counties over for, and there was a line on Saturdays, and a tip jar with her name not on it but somehow about her. And there was Sal. I'm not going to overplay it because she never did. It wasn't a romance the way my father would have understood romance. Nothing to perform, nobody to show off. It was 2 people who'd both been wrecked by life standing side by side in the dark at 3 a.m., handing each other coffee, building something out of flour and silence, and the radical idea that another person might just let you be. I asked her once if she loved him. She thought about it longer than I expected. Then she said, "I trust him." After everything, June, trust turned out to be the bigger word. I wrote that down too. I underlined it twice. I'm going to tell you the end now, and I'm going to tell it slant, because the truth of it never sat in the places I expected. And if I march it out in a straight line, I'll flatten the only thing that matters. 5 years after the green dress. My mother is 64. She does not look younger than she did at the anniversary party. That's not how this story goes, and I'd be lying to you if I sold it that way. She looks her age. She has more lines now, not fewer, but they sit differently on her face. That's the only way I can describe it. The lines used to look like things that had happened to her. Now they look like things she did. There's a difference, and you can see it across a room. She bought the bakery. Sal's knees gave out. The body keeps its own ledger, and a lifetime of standing on concrete comes due, and he wanted to retire, and he could have sold the place to a chain for more money. He sold it to my mother instead, on a handshake and a payment plan that was frankly insulting to his own self-interest. And when she protested, he did the Sal thing, which was to wave a hand and say, "It's not a gift. You'll run it better." I'm being selfish. I want to be able to come in and eat good bread until I die. And then he did exactly that. came in most mornings, sat at the counter, argued with her about crumb structure, was in every way that the word should mean home. I asked her, the day she signed the papers, if she was scared. 64 and taking on a mortgage of a whole different kind, a business, debt, the works. She laughed, the real laugh, the one I'd first heard about the wedding ring, and she said, "June, the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me happened in a rented hall in front of 40 people while I was wearing a dress I just paid off. After that, owning a building is nothing. You learn the size of the worst thing. Everything else gets measured against it. That's the part I can't read out loud. The one I warned you about at the start. You learn the size of the worst thing and everything else gets measured against it." She didn't say it to be wise. She said it the way you mentioned the weather. And that's exactly why it knocked the wind out of me, because she wasn't performing strength. She'd just become a person for whom that was a plain fact. You want to know about my father. People always do. The story isn't complete for them until they hear the villain got his. So here's the ironic part, and I'll give it to you straight, no garnish. Gerald did not get struck by lightning. He didn't lose everything. That's not how it works, and I won't insult you with it. What happened was smaller and somehow worse. He married Danielle, the new build, the tile she'd picked. And within about 3 years, the thing he'd been so frightened of, being unnecessary, being passed over, getting old, it found him anyway because it finds everyone. That's the whole brutal joke of it. You cannot outrun it by trading in a wife. Danielle was 30-something with a 30-something's life, and Gerald was a man in his 60s who'd built his entire self on being the one the room went quiet for, and the room had moved on. The dealership pushed him toward retirement. The young men he'd been so afraid of took his accounts. He got smaller, exactly as scheduled. The only difference was that the last time it happened, he'd had a partner of 34 years who knew how to make a frightened man feel like the main thing. And he'd thrown her away precisely because she was good at it, because her steadiness reminded him he was aging. And now he was aging anyway, alone in his fear, with a wife who'd never signed up to manage it. I ran into him once near the end of all this, at the hardware store of all places. He'd gotten old the way men like him get old. Suddenly, all at once, the performance finally too heavy to hold up. He asked about my mother. There was something in his face I'd never seen there before, and it took me a second to name it, and when I did, it nearly broke my heart against my will. It was envy. My father envied my mother. He'd heard about the bakery, the line on Saturdays, the people who drove from 2 counties. He'd heard she seemed happy. She always could cook, he said, and tried to make it sound generous, and it came out as the saddest sentence I'd ever heard a person say, because it was a man realizing, far too late, the exact size and worth of the thing he'd called too old to enjoy and left under a salt shaker. I didn't twist the knife. There was no knife left to twist. He was holding it himself. I just said, "She's doing fine, Dad." And then I said the truest thing I had. "She's doing better than fine. The work suits her." He nodded. He looked at the floor. I left him there in the plumbing aisle, an old man holding a fitting he probably didn't need, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the thing my mother had chosen, all those years ago at the kitchen table. I felt him become not the main thing. And it was so quiet. It was the quietest revenge in the world, and it wasn't even revenge. It was just the truth catching up, and we'd never had to lift a finger. The last thing. This past spring there was a morning. I happened to be there, helping with the Saturday rush, which I do sometimes now. And the bakery was full, that good full steam on the windows, the bell over the door going non-stop, Sal at the counter being difficult about the cinnamon ratio, the young couple with the formerly colicky baby, now a loud, sticky 5-year-old at the corner table, Mr. Prout with his coffee, the whole little ecosystem of a place that feeds people. And my mother came out from the back to refill the case, apron dusted with flour, hair going silver, and she'd long since stopped fighting it. She was carrying a tray of the bread, her bread, the grandmother recipe, the loaves she used to leave on porches like apologies and now sold faster than she could bake them. And she stopped for just a second in the middle of all that warmth and noise, and she looked around the room. I watched her do it. I had my notebook in my apron pocket. I always do. She looked around at the full tables and the steamed windows and the man at the counter who'd written "We'll fix that" before he even knew her, and the bell ringing and the line out the door, and she had the strangest expression. Not a smile, exactly. Something underneath a smile. The look of a person taking attendance of her own life and finding everyone present. She caught me watching. She didn't say anything. She just lifted the tray a little like a toast and raised an eyebrow like "Can you believe this?" and went back to filling the case. That night I tried to write down what that look had been. I sat with the notebook open for a long time. I've written down everything. The 11 words, the salt shaker, the wedding ring, all of it. This whole record I've kept because I was afraid that if I didn't write it down nobody would ever know what it actually cost her. How unglamorous it was. How she did it at 3 a.m. with cold hands and no applause. But that look I couldn't get. I still can't. I wrote 3 different sentences and crossed them all out. Maybe that's right. Maybe some things you're not supposed to pin to a page. I'll tell you the closest I got, and then I'll stop, because she'd want me to stop before I oversell it. The closest I got was this. She didn't look like a woman who'd survived something. She looked like a woman who'd been right about herself all along, and had finally found a room that agreed. The bell over the door rang again. She didn't look up from the bread.